Food insecurity is defined as the state of being without reliable access to a sufficient quantity of affordable, nutritious food. About 870 million people throughout the world are hungry, and 98% of hunger exists in underdeveloped countries. Food is something that is extremely hard to come by due to factors like conflicts, war, natural disasters, lack of clean water, and the main cause, poverty.
When famine hits, the smallest suffer. In a hospital ward in the capital city, children are severely malnourished. A distended belly and a painful skin condition are obvious symptoms of hunger.
Though many families in these places may be poor, their poverty is commonly linked to violent conflict within their country. The country may be peaceful now, but the wars and genocides that happened decades ago still have an effect on it. During war, fields are destroyed, which can leave a country without food for a temporary time. But this also has long-term effects. The field may never have an output as good as it once did, or the farmers were killed or displaced during the war. In an impoverished country such as Liberia, they were torn apart by civil war. During the long war, the country was not developing, and homes and buildings were being destroyed. Rural lands were either dangerous or uninhabitable. The only places where people could make a living for themselves was near the large cities, such as the capital of Monrovia. The cities became too packed and more people were crowding into slums surrounding the city. These slums became very unsanitary and there was not enough food and water to go around. The water was incredibly dirty and filled with nitrates and nitrites. People living there were starving and thirsty because of the Civil War. War plays a huge part in the development of a country, and if the development stops, so does food production. How does the contamination of water from irrigation, pesticides, and fertilizers affect America's agriculture? And then how does the contamination of water from human waste and garbage in third world countries affect their agriculture?
If you were to go back into, say, like the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, where more and more chemicals were being introduced as far as agriculture, pest control, etc., mostly in an effort to get greater crop yields, you found that a lot of those chemicals either got into the food products or whatever, and did a lot of damage. Sometimes it did harmful things to people directly, other times it did harmful things to other animals in the environment. And a lot of times these chemicals have a tendency to kind of like collect in as they make their way through the food chain. So what happens is that, you know, the freshwater supply can become contaminated, which leads to a lot of gastrointestinal issues for people who live down there. The people who live down there full time become more resistant to those than, say, an American traveler would.
There are many factors that explain why food is rarely available in these places. An example is widespread poverty throughout the communities. In Africa, 47% of the population live on $1.90 or less a day, an amount that is not enough to supply an entire family with food. The World Bank estimates that 10.7% of the world's population, or 767 million people, lived on less than $1.90 per day in 2013. In impoverished areas, the birth rates also tend to be high, which means that there are more mouths to feed and thus making it very difficult to feed a whole family. The poverty in these areas also causes high birth rates because of low education rates in that country. High birth rates causes a higher population without a higher food production to match the growth in population. The physiological density of a country measures the population density relative to the square miles of arable land. This is a way to measure the food security in a country. Urbanized countries almost always have a high physiological density. Small countries usually have high physiological population densities because their source of food is either imported, as is the case in places such as Europe, or are grown intensively because of the lack of land area. Large countries usually have fairly low population densities because they have farmland, but many places in Africa have a high population density for their size. They are often too poor to have food imported, and most land in the Saharan areas are not arable, seeing as much of the central regions are jungles. These African places struggle to have enough land to grow crops for their large and increasing population. Lack of land can be a major cause for hunger in these large impoverished countries.
Food in third world countries is a scarce resource. What are the biggest factors that contribute to this?
I mean, clearly one of the biggest factors is water supply. How much water do you have for irrigation, and how much water you have will obviously control the type of crops you raise. For example, rice needs very wet conditions. If you live in, for example, Egypt, you're probably not going to grow a lot of rice unless you're very close to the Nile. And also, other factors would be obviously, weather. So if you have especially dry conditions, you might have a very low crop yield, which means you have a shortage of food, creating a famine. That struggle for resources that we call natural selection in other organisms would lead to war with humans, or could lead to war with humans, unless they resolve it.
One reason why food is not available is because the water that grows the crops is not controllable. People live in areas that have no water, like deserts, which cannot grow crops. Droughts are occurring in areas that regularly are able to grow crops, but droughts leave these people without food. The environment can cause hunger, and sometimes you just can't stop it. The largest desert in the world, the Sahara Desert, has 2.5 million people living in it. The Saharan Desert receives less than 4 inches of rain per year. This leaves the soil very dry and incapable of growing crops. Even for people not living in deserts, rainfall still might run low. This is called a drought. Droughts can be detrimental, especially if it happens to a less developed country. A drought is defined as an extended period of deficient rainfall relative to the statistical multi-year average for a region. This means that it can happen to every region. When droughts occur, the crops are not watered enough, which can have 2 effects on a developing country. One effect is that there is not enough rain at all to grow any crops, which causes a famine. Famines cause much hunger and starvation. The other effect is that the country will use their water supply to water crops, which will cause the country to have less drinking water than normal, and it will cause many to be thirsty. Both living in a desert and living through a drought can be causes for starving because of the greater lack of water. Droughts are uncontrollable, but having a backup supply of water could help a country's food security. Some believe the next war could be over water. Do you agree that a World War III could be over something as fundamental as water? And can you explain why you think many people have come to this conclusion?
Well, I think they would come to the conclusion because it's the most immediate need that any population has. I mean, food, you can last days or weeks without it. Water, less than a week. So you got to have some sort of water supply, and when people don't have it, it becomes a crisis very quickly. Could it become the source of World War III? Maybe. I would say certainly regional conflicts could sprout up from the lack of water. So I would think certainly under the right circumstances, it could turn into a regional war. I'd be surprised if it turned into World War III.
So in America, there are people hungry here.
Right.
Do you think we as a country should be more focused on our own hunger rather than going to other places and helping them with their hunger problems?
Yeah, I think that, I think that we have the resources to do both. I think there's certainly the resources for it. I mean, if you just look at the amount of food that's thrown away in America every day, I mean, you could, easily feed nations of people in some of these undeveloped countries.
There are many people around the world that are starving because of different factors such as war and drought. Now we will look at how a place with food insecurity affects people on a local, regional, and global scale. In a place that has a high population of starving people, everyone in the community is affected. Lack of grocery stores in an area or lack of suitable soil to grow crops in limits the foods they can eat. If a child in a community is starving, there is a higher chance that they will become ill and transmit diseases and sickness to others around them. For underweight children, completing school is unlikely. This directly impacts how much they will earn in adulthood. On a regional scale, hunger can have dangerous impacts. In a community plagued by starvation, people are left more vulnerable to things like natural disaster and crop failure. If these such things were to occur, the surrounding area would be devastated, and it would almost certainly mean death for countless people. Hunger also causes high infant mortality rates. This is because malnourished women are at a higher risk for being ill, having smaller babies, and dying earlier. Lack of food creates poverty in many of these areas. If people are hungry, they will not be able to trade and sell their crops, which is their main source of income and food, because they will be weak and will need it for themselves in order to survive. Globally, many people around the world are affected by hunger in impoverished areas. The hungriest areas of Africa are among the world's largest producers in things such as rubber, diamonds, metals, and many other products. With hunger around the world growing, people have less energy and more sickness. Most energy and percent of the working population
are trying to get food and water for the starving people. The resources found are extracted less and shipped less efficiently. So diamonds that are needed for drill bits, saw blades, technology, and jewelry are no longer being shipped to the developed countries that need them to develop even further.
Our project is raising money for a well in Sudan. Knowing how important water is, seeing that it's vital for growing crops, how do you think it will impact the Sudanese people?
Well, I think that if you're going to an arid or semi-arid area where water is a big issue, availability of fresh water is clearly a huge improvement in their lifestyle. Being sick less often, not having to travel as far. I mean, I've heard stories of people who basically wake up in the morning, grab their containers, walk for 2-3 hours to get to their water, fill the containers, and walk home. So they literally spend half their day just transporting water to their home. So if you don't have to do that, it opens up a lot of time for you to do other things, like maybe grow food or improve your economic condition, or learn a vocation.
Hunger knows no bounds. It is throughout the world, in India, Africa, and even in the U.S. It can sprout from many things: conflict and war, drought, natural disaster, economic hardship, and poor government intervention. Conflict and war result in infertile soil and people living in unhygienic situations. Drought and natural disaster are caused by this earth and affects the crops that can grow and the water that is available to spare. Poor intervention by governments and economically troubling times inhibit families from purchasing food or rise the prices of their necessities to the point where people are thrown into poverty. Hunger impacts all of the world, not just specific areas. Though you may not be aware of it, there are many food insecure places around the world and even in your community. As a wise man named Benjamin Franklin once said, "Hunger is the best pickle."